Wind howled through the slats of the Bitter Creek depot like a dying animal. Boone hadn't come down the mountain for a rescue mission. He came for coffee beans and rifle cartridges. But there she was, a heap of freezing blue wool, stubbornly refusing to die on the platform. Snow crunched like broken glass beneath Boone's boots. The wind stripped the heat from his face in seconds, leaving his skin tight, burning, and raw. He shoved his hands deeper into his elk-hide mittens, his jaw set so hard his teeth ached. Bitter Creek was a graveyard pretending to be a town. It consisted of 3 false front buildings leaning away from the wind, a mercantile that permanently smelled of rancid bacon grease and wet sawdust, and the iron-roofed train depot. Boone hated coming down the mountain. The air down here felt thin, choked with coal smoke and the sour, desperate stench of men waiting out the winter. He had packed his sled with 50 pounds of flour, 2 tins of black powder, and enough salted pork to see him through until the spring thaw. The sky above the ridgeline was already turning the bruised, heavy purple that meant a whiteout was hours away. He needed to be above the tree line before the snow blindsided the trail. He yanked the cinch tight over the tarp, ignoring the annoyed snort of his lead mule. Then he heard it. It wasn't a cry for help. It was a shallow, rattling intake of breath, barely audible over the screech of the wind against the depot's corrugated tin roof. Boone froze. He turned his head slowly, snow crusting on his heavy beard. Tucked into the narrow, shadowed alcove between the ticket window and the freight scale sat a woman, or at least what looked like one. She was huddled into a tight, miserable ball, wrapped in a dark blue wool coat that was already dusted with a half-inch of snow. Her knees were pulled to her chest. Beside her sat a battered leather medical satchel, its brass clasps rusted shut with ice. Boone exhaled a harsh plume of steam. "Damn it," he muttered. He didn't walk over immediately. He stood by his sled, weighing the situation. The station master had locked up and gone to the saloon 2 hours ago. The westbound train wasn't coming. The tracks through the pass were buried under 10 feet of drift. Whoever had dumped her here, a stagecoach driver or a passing freight wagon, had left her for dead. Boone wanted to get on his sled and drive away. He liked the quiet of his cabin. He liked the predictable, solitary rhythm of staying alive. Another person meant noise. It meant splitting rations. It meant liability. He took a step toward the mules. The woman's head listed to the side, striking the frozen wooden planks of the siding with a hollow, sickening thud. Boone cursed again, louder this time, and stomped over to the alcove. Up close, the reality of her condition was grim. Her lips were cracked and split, bleeding sluggishly into the corners of her mouth. The blood had frozen into dark red beads. Frost clumped in her eyelashes, matting them together. Her skin was the color of bruised milk, completely devoid of blood. She smelled faintly of carbolic soap, stale lavender, and the sharp, metallic tang of freezing damp cotton. "Hey!" Boone grunted, nudging her boot with the toe of his leather pack. No response. The boot felt as rigid as a piece of firewood. He crouched down, his knees popping in the cold, and pulled off one of his heavy mittens. He pressed 2 thick, calloused fingers against the side of her neck. Her skin was terrifyingly cold, like touching the metal barrel of his rifle left out overnight. But beneath the ice-cold surface, a pulse fluttered. It was erratic, slow, like a moth trapped in a jar. "Wake up," he said, shaking her shoulder. Her head lolled. Suddenly, her eyes snapped open. They weren't focused. They were wide, frantic, and completely feral. Before Boone could react, she swung at him. It was a weak, pathetic strike, her rigid, frostbitten fingers scraping uselessly across the thick canvas of his coat. "Don't," she croaked. Her voice sounded like dry leaves crushed underfoot. "Don't touch the bag." Boone stared at her, annoyed. She was dying of hypothermia, minutes away from her organs shutting down, and she was guarding a leather satchel. "I don't want your bag, lady," Boone said harshly. "I want to not trip over your corpse when I come back for spring supplies." He didn't wait for her permission. He grabbed her under the armpits. She weighed practically nothing, but the stiffness of her body made hauling her up awkward. She whimpered, a high, thin sound of absolute agony as her frozen joints were forced to bend. Boone felt a brief, unwelcome flicker of guilt, but he shoved it down. Gentleness wasn't going to save her. Speed was. He dragged her toward the sled, her boots dragging uselessly through the snow, leaving twin trenches behind them. She tried to fight him again, her elbow digging weakly into his ribs. "Stop moving, or I drop you right here," he snapped, his breath pluming in her face. She went limp, not out of compliance, but out of sheer exhaustion. Her eyes rolled back. Boone reached the sled and practically threw her onto the bed of supplies. He didn't arrange her comfortably. He didn't cradle her head. He just shoved her between the sack of flour and the crate of black powder. He unstrapped a massive, foul-smelling bear hide from the back of the sled and tossed it over her, tucking the stiff, heavy edges around her shivering form. The pelt smelled strongly of old fat and wood ash. He grabbed the satchel from the alcove, tossing it carelessly onto her chest under the hide. Stepping up onto the runners, Boone cracked the leather reins over the mules' backs. "Ha!" he roared. The animals strained against the harnesses, annoyed by the added weight, their hooves slipping on the ice before catching traction. The wind picked up, a violent gust that nearly knocked Boone off the runners. He didn't look back at the town. He just stared up at the mountain, calculating the hours it would take to reach his cabin, wondering if the frozen lump of blue wool under the bear hide would still be breathing by the time they got there. The ascent was a grinding, miserable test of endurance. The sled runners shrieked against exposed rock and packed ice. The temperature plummeted as they climbed above the tree line, the air growing so violently cold it hurt to draw it into the lungs. Boone stood on the back of the sled, his face wrapped in a wool scarf, his eyes narrowed against the blinding, horizontal snow. Every time the sled hit a rut, Boone listened. He listened for a groan, a shift, any sign of life from the mound beneath the bear hide. For the first 2 hours, there was nothing. He began to run the grim logistics in his head, how hard the ground near the cabin was, how deep he'd have to chip into the permafrost to bury a woman he didn't even know. But as they crested the final ridge, a muffled, ragged cough drifted back to him. She was still fighting. Boone's cabin sat tucked into the leeward side of a massive granite outcropping, sheltered from the worst of the northern gales. It wasn't a home. It was a fortress. The logs were thick, chinked with mud and horsehair, the roof heavy with 2 feet of snow insulation. He pulled the mules to a halt by the lean-to. His fingers were so numb they felt like wooden blocks as he fumbled with the harnesses. He left the supplies on the sled. They wouldn't spoil in this cold. He walked around to the bear hide and pulled it back. The woman's face was chalky, her lips now a terrifying shade of blue-black. Frost covered her eyebrows entirely. Boone didn't bother speaking. He scooped her up, grunting at the dead weight, and kicked the heavy oak door of his cabin open. Inside, it was only marginally warmer than outside. The air smelled of stale wood smoke, dried sage, and the sharp musk of cured deer meat hanging from the rafters. The hearth was dead, a pile of gray ash from the morning's fire. He dumped her onto the narrow cot pushed against the far wall. The ropes groaned under the sudden weight. "Don't move," he commanded the unconscious woman. Boone moved frantically. He grabbed a handful of dry pine needles and cedar bark from the kindling box, struck a sulfur match against the stone chimney, and coaxed a small flame to life. He piled on split oak, blowing on the embers until the fire caught with a greedy crackle. Only when the hearth began to radiate a faint, dry heat did he turn his attention back to his unwanted guest. Thawing out someone with deep cold in their bones is not a romantic process. It is violent, messy, and excruciatingly painful. Boone dragged a heavy cast-iron kettle over the flames and then walked to the cot. The woman's clothes were frozen solid, a stiff carapace of wet wool and cotton that was pulling whatever remaining heat she had out of her core. "I'm taking these off," he muttered to the empty room. He grabbed the lapels of her blue coat. The buttons were frozen into their buttonholes. Boone didn't have the patience or the dexterity to unfasten them. He pulled his hunting knife from his belt, a thick carbon steel blade smelling of oil, and sliced the buttons off. They pinged against the wooden floorboards. He peeled the coat back. Underneath, she wore a high-collared shirtwaist and a heavy wool skirt. Both were damp. He stripped them away with clinical, rough efficiency. He didn't look at her body with any interest. He looked at it the way a butcher inspects a carcass for rot. He was looking for black flesh. Her legs were mottled purple and white, the skin cold as marble. Her toes were waxen. Chilblains were already forming angry red welts around her ankles. She groaned, a deep, guttural sound, and her eyelids fluttered. "Wah," she choked out. Her teeth began to chatter so violently, Boone could hear them clacking together from 3 feet away. "Hold still," Boone said. He grabbed a rough wool blanket from the chair and threw it over her, tucking it tight around her shoulders. She flailed, her hand instinctively reaching down to clutch the blanket to her chest. Her eyes locked onto him. In the flickering firelight, Boone saw that they were a sharp, pale green, but right now, they were dilated with panic. She saw the knife still in his hand. She saw her torn clothes on the floor. "You," she gasped, trying to scramble backward, but her legs refused to cooperate. She let out a sharp cry of pain as blood began to forcibly push its way back into her frozen capillaries. "Calm down," Boone said, his voice flat, exhausted. He tossed the knife onto the table, where it clattered loudly. "You were freezing to death at the depot. I brought you up the mountain. Your clothes were ice." She pressed her back against the log wall, her breath coming in ragged, rapid pants. The pain of the thaw was hitting her now. The pins and needles of returning circulation felt like broken glass grinding through her veins. She squeezed her eyes shut, a tear leaking out and tracking down her dirty cheek. "My bag," she whispered through clenched teeth. Boone frowned. "Your bag is outside on the sled." "Get it," she ordered. The authority in her weak, raspy voice caught him off guard. It wasn't a plea, it was a command. Now, Boone crossed his arms over his chest, his shadow looming large and dark against the cabin wall. "I'm not going back out there right now. You need to get warm." "I am a nurse," she said, opening her eyes to glare at him. Her jaw trembled violently. "My name is Josephine. In that bag is a tin of camphor ointment and willow bark. If you don't want my toes to rot and stink up your cabin, you will go get it." Boone stared at her. She was half naked under a blanket, shivering so hard the cot frame rattled, her lips bleeding. Yet she was looking at him like he was a subordinate who had mopped the floor incorrectly. He felt a sudden, sharp urge to laugh. He didn't. Instead, he scowled, turned on his heel, and stalked toward the door. "Fine, Josephine," he grumbled, yanking the door open to a blast of swirling snow. "But if you die while I'm getting it, I'm throwing you back outside." As the door slammed shut, Josephine squeezed her eyes shut, burying her face in the coarse wool of the blanket. The smell of the bear hide still clung to her skin. She was in a stranger's cabin, trapped in a blizzard, and her legs felt like they were being chewed off by wolves. But she could feel the heat of the fire. She was alive, and for now, that would have to be enough. Smoke hung heavy under the low ceiling of the cabin, violently cut by the sharp, eye-watering fumes of camphor and rendered bear fat. It had been 4 days since Boone dragged Josephine out of the blizzard. The storm hadn't broken. It raged against the thick log walls with a sustained, malicious fury, burying the windows under drifts so high the cabin was plunged into a perpetual, claustrophobic twilight. Boone hated the smell. It overpowered the familiar, comforting odors of dried sage and old wood ash. He sat in the corner by the hearth, a heavy piece of split hickory resting on his thigh, methodically dragging a draw knife toward his chest to shave off long, curled ribbons of wood. He wasn't making anything. He was just making shavings. He needed to move his hands so he wouldn't lose his mind. Across the cramped room, behind a makeshift partition Boone had rigged from a greasy canvas tarp, Josephine was treating her feet. The silence between them was thick, broken only by the scrape of Boone's blade and the ragged hitches of Josephine's breathing. Healing from deep frostbite was a brutal, ugly business. Her toes had swollen to the size of bruised plums, the skin blistering and weeping a clear, sticky fluid. "I need boiling water." Her voice rasped from behind the canvas. It wasn't a request. It sounded like an order barked in a crowded hospital ward. Boone's jaw tightened. He paused the draw knife, his thumbs resting on the worn wooden handles. "Pot's on the hook," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. "Pour it yourself." A beat of silence. Then the sound of rustling wool, followed by a sharp, poorly stifled hiss of agony. Boone closed his eyes, exhaling a long breath through his nose. He hated this. He hated the guilt she forced onto him just by existing in his space. He threw the hickory log onto the floor. It landed with a loud, resonant thud. He stood, ducked under the low-hanging bundles of dried venison, and grabbed a thick rag to lift the cast-iron kettle off the fire. He pushed the canvas aside with his shoulder. Josephine sat on the edge of the narrow cot. She wore one of his spare flannel shirts. It swallowed her entirely. The sleeves rolled up past her elbows. Her bare legs dangled over the side, the skin a horrific patchwork of angry red and mottled purple. She had a tin basin clamped between her knees. Her face was pale, glistening with a cold sweat, her jaw clamped tight enough to crack teeth. Boone didn't look at her face. He looked at the basin. He tipped the kettle, pouring a steaming stream of water over the willow bark she had crushed into the bottom. The smell of wet earth and bitter tannins rose into the air. Enough, she clipped out. He stopped pouring. He stood there for a second, watching her dip a torn strip of clean cotton into the scalding water. She didn't hesitate. She wrung it out, her knuckles turning white, and immediately pressed the steaming rag over the swollen, blistering flesh of her left foot. Her breath rushed out in a harsh, whistling gasp, her entire body rigid with shock. Her fingers dug violently into the mattress, ticking. Boone felt his stomach twist, a completely involuntary reaction. "You're burning yourself." "I'm drawing out the infection," she managed to say, her voice shaking violently. She didn't remove the rag. She pressed it harder. "If the tissue dies, I lose the foot. If I lose the foot, I can't walk. If I can't walk, I'm dead." It was a cold, brutal calculation. Boone respected it, even if watching it turned his gut to lead. He set the kettle back on the hearth and retreated to his corner, picking up the hickory wood again. The proximity was suffocating him. He was a man who lived by the vast open spaces of the timberline. He knew the rhythm of the seasons, the migratory paths of the elk, the exact sound a dry branch makes before a grizzly steps into a clearing. He did not know how to handle the heavy, expectant air of another human being. Later that evening, the fire had burned down to a pile of pulsing orange embers. The wind outside had dropped from a scream to a low, rhythmic moan. Boone was cooking. He dumped a handful of coarse cornmeal into a skillet of hot bacon grease, watching it sizzle and pop before cracking 2 dried, salted quail eggs over the top. The grease spat, burning his wrist. He ignored it. He scraped the heavy metal spatula against the cast iron, the noise jarring in the quiet cabin. He scooped the mess onto 2 tin plates and walked over to the cot. Josephine was lying on her back, staring at the ceiling beams. The blisters on her feet were bound tightly in white cotton strips. He held a plate out. "Eat." She slowly turned her head. Her pale green eyes looked hollow, bruised by exhaustion. She pushed herself up onto her elbows, wincing as her core muscles strained. She took the plate with trembling hands. "Thank you," she muttered. Boone sat on a wooden stool a few feet away, eating his own food in rapid mechanical bites. He didn't eat for pleasure. He ate for fuel. Josephine poked at the greasy cornmeal with a fork. "You don't talk much," she observed. Her voice was stronger tonight, the dry rattle finally gone. "Nothing to say," Boone replied without looking up. "You haven't even asked me why I was at the depot." Boone swallowed a mouthful of heavy food. He set his plate on his knee and looked at her, really looked at her. Her hair, which had been matted with ice and sweat, was drying into a chaotic halo of dark, frizzy waves. Her face was harsh, angular, devoid of the soft, compliant features men usually prized in the settlements down below. There was a hard, immovable stubbornness set deep in her jawline. "I figure," Boone said slowly, his voice flat. "A woman dumped at a frozen train station with a medical bag, and no escort either killed a man or pissed off a man who thought he owned her. Neither is my business." Josephine stopped chewing. A slow, dark flush crept up her neck. It wasn't embarrassment. It was pure, unadulterated rage. "I didn't kill anyone," she said, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "I saved a man, a teenage boy, crushed pelvis in the silver mine at Black Ridge. The foreman wanted to leave him in the tunnel because pulling him out would halt the ore carts for a day." Boone stayed quiet, watching the firelight flicker across her angry eyes. I threatened to cut the foreman's throat with my surgical scalpel if he didn't give me 3 men to haul the boy out, she continued, her hands gripping the tin plate tight enough to dent the edges. I kept the boy alive. The foreman fired me, refused my back pay, and paid a freight driver to dump me at Bitter Creek to wait for a train that wasn't coming. She stared at Boone, daring him to judge her, daring him to offer some hollow, polite sympathy. Boone didn't offer sympathy. He wiped his mouth with the back of his hand, picked up his plate, and stood. Should have cut his throat, Boone said simply. He walked back to the hearth, dumped his empty plate in the wash bucket, and didn't say another word for the rest of the night. The morning the storm broke. The silence woke Boone before the light did. The oppressive, relentless roar of the wind had simply ceased, replaced by a stillness so profound it felt heavy. He kicked off his heavy wool blankets, the cold air of the cabin immediately biting into his skin. He pulled on his boots, grabbed his heavy canvas coat, and threw the door open. The glare was blinding. The world outside was buried under 4 feet of untouched, pristine white. The sky was an impossible, violent shade of blue, entirely devoid of clouds. The pine trees slumped heavily under the weight of the snow, occasionally dropping massive, powdery clumps with a soft whump that echoed across the valley. Boone breathed in deeply. The air was so cold it burned his lungs, tasting of ozone and frozen pine sap. He felt a massive weight lift off his chest. The trap was open. He could breathe again. He spent the next 3 hours outside. He cleared the snow away from the door, dug a trench to the woodpile, and spent 40 minutes aggressively splitting frozen oak logs with an axe. The physical labor felt incredible. The muscles in his back and shoulders, tight from days of hunching in the cabin, stretched and burned. He stripped off his coat, working only in his thermal shirt, sweat freezing into his beard. When he finally carried an armful of split wood back inside, he found Josephine out of the cot. He stopped in the doorway, snow melting off his boots onto the floorboards. She was standing by the small wooden table, gripping the edge so hard her knuckles were white. She had managed to put on her wool skirt, though the hem dragged on the floor because she couldn't wear boots. Her feet were wrapped thickly in rags. She was swaying slightly, her face pale, her breathing shallow and rapid. "What are you doing?" Boone barked, dropping the wood into the bin with a loud clatter. Josephine flinched at the noise but didn't let go of the table. "I am walking," she said, her teeth gritted. "You're tearing open your blisters," he shot back, crossing the room in 3 long strides. "Sit down." "I have been sitting for 6 days," she snapped, turning her head to glare at him. The movement threw off her balance. Her bad foot took her weight, and her knee buckled instantly. She let out a sharp cry as she went down. Boone lunged, his thick, calloused hands catching her under the arms before she hit the floor. The momentum dragged him down to one knee. Suddenly, they were chest to chest, tangled together in the middle of the cramped cabin. Boone froze. He could feel the rapid, frantic pounding of her heart against his ribs. She smelled like camphor, sweat, and the sharp, acidic tang of fear. His hands, massive and rough with axe calluses, were wrapped tightly around her rib cage. He felt her flinch at his touch, not out of pain, but out of a sudden, raw vulnerability. For a long moment, neither of them moved. The only sound was the crackle of the fire and their harsh breathing. Josephine looked up at him. She was inches away. Boone saw the fine lines around her eyes, the dark smudges of exhaustion, the tiny, jagged scar splitting her lower lip where it had frozen and cracked. He suddenly realized how incredibly strong she was to simply be alive, let alone trying to stand. "I've got you," Boone said. His voice was lower than usual, stripped of its habitual gruffness. Josephine swallowed hard. The fierce independence that usually shielded her face faltered for a second. She didn't push him away. Her hands, surprisingly strong and rough from medical work, gripped his forearms. "It hurts," she confessed. The admission was barely a whisper. It was the first time she had complained about the actual pain, rather than the inconvenience of it. "I know," Boone said. He didn't try to coddle her. He didn't sweep her up into his arms like a dime novel hero. He simply shifted his weight, gripped her tightly, and hauled her back to her feet, acting as a human crutch as she hopped awkwardly back to the cot. She sank onto the mattress with a heavy sigh, her hands immediately going to her bandaged feet. A small red stain was seeping through the white cotton on her right heel. Boone stood by the cot, his hands suddenly feeling empty and awkward. He wiped them on his denim trousers. "You broke a blister." "I can feel that," she muttered, reaching for her medical bag on the floor. Boone beat her to it. He scooped up the heavy leather satchel and dropped it onto her lap. "You need to stay off them for another week. The cold out there will rot the skin right off the bone if you try to put a boot on." Josephine unbuckled the satchel, pulling out a fresh roll of bandages. She didn't look at him. "I can't stay here for another week. I'm eating your supplies. I'm taking up your space. I have enough flour and pork to feed a cavalry troop," Boone lied smoothly. He actually had exactly enough for himself, but calculating half rations was a math problem he was suddenly willing to solve. He walked over to the stove, grabbing the coffee pot, and the space was too quiet anyway. Josephine paused, her hands hovering over her bandages. She looked up at Boone's broad back as he poured water into the pot. A strange, tight knot in her chest, one that had been wound tight since the mine boss ordered her thrown onto the freight wagon, loosened just a fraction. "Boone," she said quietly. He glanced over his shoulder. "If I stay," she said, her voice finding its familiar commanding edge, "I'm cooking. Your cornmeal tastes like salted sawdust." Boone stared at her for a second.